Imagine awakening one day to the chilling realization that every hardship you've endured, every illness, every confusing or painful moment can be traced back to one horrifying source. And worst of all, it isn't your fault. You come to understand that your shaking limbs, your labored breathing, your clouded mind all originate from choices made long before your birth. Your parents, consumed by a fixation on maintaining bloodline purity, have doomed you to a life of torment. You learn that your mother is also your cousin, your father, your uncle, and your grandmother doubles as your great aunt. This isn't a family tree, it's a coiled serpent devouring itself. You weren't born out of love, but from a calculated planon designed to protect dynastic power and fortune, regardless of the human toll. This isn't the plot of a Gothic novel. It was a tragic reality for countless women across history caught in a genetic fate they never agreed to. Before we delve into their overlooked stories of pain and perseverance, it's worth reflecting on how incredible it is that we can explore these forgotten chapters together, united by our shared curiosity about the past, no matter where in the world we are. To truly grasp what these women endured, we must first examine the twisted rationale that shaped their suffering. For generations, European aristocracies believed that marrying within their own family was essential to maintaining their sacred right to rule. They viewed their noble blood as fundamentally superior to that of the general population, holier, chosen, and untouchable. By the 1500s, royal dynasties across Europe had become one sprawling network of intertwined kin cousins marrying cousins, nieces wedded to uncles, even siblings producing heirs to empires. What they failed to realize, or perhaps refused to see, was that they were engineering a hereditary disaster that would echo for centuries. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Habsburg dynasty of Spain and Austria, who mastered the deadly art of matrimonial self-destruction. Their unofficial slogan could have read, "Let others fight wars, you, happy Austria, wed within." But these were not joyous unions. They were biologically hazardous arrangements that gave rise to some of history's most heartbreaking lives. Our journey begins in Vienna in the year 1634. Deep within the dimly lit halls of the Hofburg Palace, a baby girl is born into a legacy of agony. Her name is Maria Anna of Austria, and her fate has already sealed her DNA, a roadmap of centuries of intra-family unions. Her lineage a tangled snare. From her earliest days, Maria Anna senses she's not like other children. While her peers run and laugh, she battles to stand upright. Her spine twists unnaturally, leaving her hunched and gasping for breath. Her jaw juts out so prominently that consuming solid food becomes a daily challenge. Servants must carefully mince her food into bite-sized fragments, yet even with these efforts, every meal turns into a taxing ritual of deliberate chewing and cautious swallowing. And still, Maria Anna's physical afflictions pale in comparison to the emotional burden of realizing the cause of her misery. She matures beneath the watchful eyes of ancestral portraits, and in each familiar gaze, she recognizes reflections of her own condition: an uncle, bearing her jutting jaw, a grandmother hunched with the same distorted spine. The horrifying revelation dawns slowly. She is not an anomaly. She is merely the latest casualty in an unbroken chain of hereditary devastation. The court physicians, wielding leeches and prayer instead of understanding, are helpless to ease her suffering. Behind closed doors, they murmur about the infamous Habsburg curse, but never in her presence. To her face, they speak only in riddles, mystic ailments, and divine judgment, never daring to voice the truth that all are aware of. Her agony is the consequence of an obsessive quest to keep the royal blood untainted. Maria Anna's days unfold in shadowed chambers, heavy drapes drawn to shield her from prying eye sand to keep the outside world from seeing her. She becomes an insatiable reader, her intellect one of the few aspects of her being that remains unharmed. In the pages of books, she escapes into realms where lineage is irrelevant, where marriages are forged from affection, not politics, and where children aren't cursed by the choices of those who came before. But fantasy cannot replace reality. Physicians prod and chart her condition with cold precision, measuring the severity of her spinal curve, the abnormal angle of her jaw, the fragility of her limbs. To them, she is no longer a young woman, but a cautionary example living proof of genetic hubris gone unchecked. Worse than her physical deterioration is the aching solitude. Prospective suitor seeks one a relative draw back in discomfort upon meeting her. Negotiations for marriage stall the moment her ailments are revealed. She remains unmarried, not due to lack of desire, but because no one will accept her no even in a society where cousin marriage is commonplace. Her deformities are simply too profound. At just 32, Maria Anna succumbs to the cumulative toll of genetic collapse. The official record lists various illnesses, yet never acknowledges the truth. She perished because her family prioritized dynastic purity over basic humanity. We now turn our gaze to Spain and to one of the most tragic characters in this grim history, Joanna of Castile, known as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain and sponsored Columbus's explorations, Joanna appeared destined for power. Instead, her life became a somber warning about the cost of bloodline obsession. Joanna displayed no signs of mental instability as a child. She was bright, well-educated, fluent in several languages, but the seeds of her downfall had already been planted deep in her genetic code. Her parents were first cousins, members of the same closed network of European nobility that had been interbreeding for generations. The initial signs began to surface after her arranged marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a union forged to bolster political ties but which soon devolved into emotional warfare. Philip proved unfaithful, distant, and manipulative. Joanna, in turn, responded with an overwhelming, all-consuming devotion that many around her labeled insanity. But was it truly madness, or was it simply the desperate reaction of a woman trapped in an unbearable situation? Joanna had been taught from a young age that her ultimate role in life was to marry and bear children, that producing heirs was a divine responsibility. When her marriage became a relentless source of emotional trauma and humiliation, her psyche began to crumble under the strain. The true descent began with Philip's sudden death in 1506. Joanna's mourning spiraled into fixation. She refused to let his body be buried, instead journeying across Spain with the coffin, unsealing it regularly to embrace and kiss his decaying remains. It's a disturbing image, but it reflects a deeper truth. Joanna had been so cut off from real human affection that not even death could sever her bond to the one person who, despite his cruelty, had acknowledged her presence. Her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles V, seized upon her alleged madness as justification to strip her of power. For 46 years, Joanna was imprisoned within the convent walls of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The environment was brutal, dark, damp chambers, minimal sustenance, and no access to basic hygiene. Reports from her attendants describe her going unwashed for weeks, shredding her garments in fits, and screaming through long hours of the night. But this raises a crucial question. Was Joanna genuinely insane, or was she driven to that point by relentless emotional abuse and confinement? Increasingly, historians argue that her madness was politically convenient, a pretext to sideline a legitimate monarch. Her intense and erratic actions, while alarming, align with symptoms of deep psychological trauma, severe anxiety, clinical depression, and post-traumatic stress intensified by prolonged social isolation. And then there's the genetic factor. Joanna's lineage reveals a recurring pattern of psychological instability, depression, nervous disorders, and emotional fragility, all of which worsen in cases of inbreeding. Her great-grandmother exhibited similar signs, and Joanna's daughter Catherine would later suffer from profound depression. The pattern was unmistakable for those who dared to see it. In 1555, Joanna died still confined, still labeled insane. Her passing went almost unacknowledged, her memory wiped from public life long before, dismissed as a troublesome lunatic rather than mourned as a casualty of a system that sacrificed people for power. We now move into the gleaming courts of 17th century Spain, where a delicate child named Margaret Teresa bore the burdens of empire in her frail frame. Born in 1651 to Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, his His own niece Margaret entered a world where such unions were not scandalous but expected. The Habsburgs had embraced inbreeding so thoroughly that uncles marrying their brothers' daughters had become routine, even celebrated. Margaret Teresa's early years are immortalized in breathtaking detail through the paintings of Diego Velázquez, the esteemed portraitist of the Spanish monarchy. In these works, we don't see a carefree child surrounded by toys, we see a young girl cloaked in layers of ceremonial finery, her innocent face already marked by the subtle indicators of the Habsburg genetic legacy. Study Velázquez's brushwork closely, and you'll detect what he dared not state overtly, yet refused to conceal entirely. Her lower jaw extends ever so slightly, just enough to foreshadow the severe disfigurements that would worsen as she aged. Her gaze carries a faraway, hollow, luxuriant evidence of possible developmental issues. Her bearing, even in youth, hints at the skeletal afflictions that ran through her lineage. Yet, what makes Margaret Teresa's life most heartbreaking isn't her fragile health, it's the total absence of control she had over her destiny. From the moment of her birth, her fate is shaped entirely by men who regard her not as a child or individual, but as a strategic pawn. Before she can walk properly, she is pledged to marry her uncle, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. Across Europe, the engagement is hailed as a grand diplomatic success. Few pause to consider what it means for the little girl at the heart of it. Margaret grows up fully aware that her existence serves one purpose: to wed her uncle and produce heirs who will carry on the family name. She is given the highest quality education available to noblewomen at the time. She learns languages, masters music, painting, and courtly etiquette. But every lesson is designed to groom her for Mariageno, to enrich her mind or soul. In 1666, at just 15, Margaret Teresa becomes a bride. Leopold is 26, and, more disturbingly, her biological uncle, father's younger brother. The wedding unfolds with the splendor and spectacle befitting royalty, but for Margaret, it marks the death of her youth and the beginning of relentless obligation. Though historical records are vague, they imply a difficult reality. Margaret is expected to conceive right away, regardless of her frailty and tender age. The burden is enormous. The future of the Habsburg line rests on her ability to produce robust male heirs. She conceives several times, but each pregnancy ends in sorrow. Her first child, a daughter, survives only a few months. Her second ends in miscarriage. Eventually, she bears a son who makes it through infancy, and the royal court breathes a collective sigh of relief only to realize the child exhibits the full array of inherited Habsburg disorders. Margaret Teresa, meanwhile, deteriorates rapidly with each pregnancy. The combination of inherited health conditions and the exhausting demands of repeated childbirth devastates her system. She develops what modern medicine would likely identify as severe anemia, breathing complications, and potentially epilepsy. Court doctors observe and catalog her physical collapse with a detached professionalism that only adds to the tragedy. They record her growing difficulties with speech, her frequent convulsions, her inability to digest solid food, but they never acknowledge the root cause: the irreversible genetic damage inflicted by generations of incestuous unions. Margaret Teresa passes away in 1673, only 6 years after her wedding, at the age of 21. While official accounts cite fever as the cause of death, the reality is far more grim. Her body simply collapsed under the cumulative burden of inherited disorders and relentless physical strain. Across the empire, her death is met with mourning, but not for the reasons it should be. Courtiers and diplomats grieve not for the loss of her life, but for the unrealized potential to bear more heirs, oblivious or indifferent to the fact that her existence had been sacrificed to uphold a bloodline already irreparably corrupted. We now travel to the opulent court of Versailles, where beneath the surface of majestic rituals and architectural splendor, another Spanish-born royal Anna of Austria wrestles with the unseen price of her Habsburg lineage. Born in 1601, she is the product of yet another uncle-niece marriage between Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, pairing viewed not only as acceptable in royal circles but even advantageous. Anna's childhood in Madrid mirrors the all-too-common pattern of Habsburg genetic consequences. Her development is noticeably delayed. She demonstrates the cognitive difficulties typical of many inbred royals. Her jaw juts forward, complicating both speech and nourishment. More sorrowfully, she exhibits clear signs of what modern psychiatry would diagnose as severe anxiety and chronic depression conditions that haunt her every day. At 14, Anna is married off to Louis XIII of France in 1615, part of a grand political maneuver meant to forge peace between two historical rivals, Spain and France. But little attention is paid to what this drastic upheaval means for Anna. She is ripped from her home and culture, dropped into an unfamiliar court where she is expected to master a new language, adopt foreign customs, and perform her duties as queen without hesitation. Though the French nobility initially greet her with elaborate fanfare, the reality soon sets in. Louis XIII is emotionally distant and detached, showing minimal affection for his young bride. He battles his own psychological demons. Contemporary scholars suspect he suffered from deep depression and possibly repressed sexuality subjects, considered taboo in the rigid confines of royal protocol. Anna becomes ensnared in a cruel paradox. As queen, she is expected to produce male heirs, yet as a Habsburg, her genetic inheritance makes successful pregnancies painfully rare. Her early attempts at motherhood end in heartbreak miscarriages and infant deaths that exacerbate her fragile emotional state. Royal physicians, limited by the science of their era, place the blame squarely on Anna. They consider her failures to be the result of female weakness rather than genetic predisposition. She is subjected to increasingly invasive and degrading medical interventions, bloodletting, forced purges, and strange dietary regimens. Her private anatomy is examined repeatedly in search of supposed flaws in her feminine constitution. Never does it occur to the court doctors that the root issue may be embedded in her genetic inheritance centuries of intermarriage within the Habsburg dynasty. As the years pass with no surviving male heir, Anna's seclusion intensifies. Whispers spread throughout the court. She is cursed. Her marriage is a divine mistake. France needs a new queen. She becomes the focal point of courtly intrigue and malicious gossip. Under the mounting scrutiny, Anna begins exhibiting symptoms that modern clinicians would classify as severe agoraphobia. She increasingly avoids public appearances, retreating into her quarters for days on end. Her already strained relationship with Louis XIII worsens, with each spouse quietly blaming the other for their inability to conceive. They begin living separate lives, reuniting only when royal duty makes it unavoidable. In her solitude, Anna turns inward toward religion. She clings to Catholicism with fervent intensity, praying endlessly and developing a near-obsessive attachment to ritual. Then, unexpectedly, a miracle occurs. After 23 years of marriage, she delivers a healthy baby boy, the future Louis XIV, known as the Sun King. All of France rejoices, interpreting the birth as a sign of divine blessing. But for Anna, it's a double-edged sword, a moment of triumph overshadowed by a renewed fear. Her worth now tied to her fertility, she knows the pressure is far from over. 2 years later, she bears a second son, Philippe, solidifying the royal succession and easing some of the pressure. Yet the emotional and physical scars from decades of struggle remain. Anna remains deeply troubled, plagued by anxiety and depression that rob her of peace. Even in motherhood, her final years are marked by declining health troubles with digestion, breathing difficulties, and what royal doctors refer to as episodes of melancholy that leave her bedridden for long stretches. Modern interpretations suggest she suffered from severe mood and anxiety disorder ailments made more acute by both her genetic makeup and the trauma of her early life in a hostile foreign court. Anna dies in 1666, having outlived her husband and seen her son rise to become one of the most formidable monarchs in European history. But her true legacy isn't found in the victories of French statecraft. It lies in the heavy human toll exacted by a royal system that treated women as vessels and ignored the biological costs of keeping dynasties pure. Marie Antoinette, though chiefly remembered for her role during the French Revolution, is another figure whose life was shaped by the lingering legacy of Habsburg inbreeding. Born in 1755, she was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Though not as genetically entangled as some of her ancestors, her lineage still bore the cumulative weight of centuries of consanguineous unions. Marie Antoinette arrived in France in 1770 as a 14-year-old bride, bringing not only the diplomatic hopes of the Austrian-French alliance, but also the unseen legacy of Habsburg genetic baggage. In her portraits by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun and others, we see a radiant queen, but also hints of the family's hereditary features, the subtly prominent lower lip and the signature Habsburg chin, traits intensified over generations of inbreeding. Yet Marie Antoinette's most profound challenges weren't evident at first glance. As with many Habsburg heirs, she endured what contemporary physicians called female troubles, debilitating menstrual irregularities, frequent pregnancy losses, and what modern endocrinologists might classify as hormone-related disorders, likely inherited. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI was rocky from the outset, but not for the scandalous reasons whispered about at court. Both Louis and Marie were burdened with inherited issues. Louis exhibited signs of delayed development and extreme social awkwardness that hindered intimacy. Marie, in turn, struggled with the anxiety and depressive tendencies long present in her family's women. The pressure to bear an heir was suffocating. For 7 years, the marriage remained unconsummated, fueling vicious court gossip. Doctors frequently examined Marie, searching for physical explanations for the couple's failure to conceive. What they failed to grasp was that both spouses were likely contending with complex, psychological and possibly physiological repercussions of their inbred ancestry. When she finally became pregnant, the ordeal was far from over. Her first pregnancy brought unrelenting nausea, panic episodes, and what we now recognize as antenatal depression. Although her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived and thrived, later pregnancies ended in miscarriage or early infant death, each loss compounding her emotional turmoil. What makes Marie Antoinette's tragedy uniquely devastating is how her fragile psychological state intersected with France's political unraveling. Her anxiety and depressive symptoms, perhaps intensified by inherited hormonal imbalances, severely hindered her ability to respond rationally to the rapidly changing political landscape. Her tendency toward impetuous decisions and emotional display shameless in peace proved disastrous amid revolution. As the crisis deepened, observers noted that her moods became increasingly unstable. She vacillated between bursts of nervous activity and long bouts of melancholy, unable to offer the steady leadership the moment demanded. Scholars continue to debate whether her erratic behavior was born of external stress alone or compounded by psychiatric predispositions rooted in Habsburg genetics. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she likely never uttered, became a cruel shorthand for her supposed indifference. In truth, her greatest flaw may have been emotional vulnerability. She was overwhelmed by the anguish surrounding her and unequipped, psychologically, to navigate it. Throughout her trial in captivity, Marie Antoinette demonstrated surprising bravery, but also the telltale signs of dissociative states that had plagued other Habsburg women under extreme psychological strain. During her imprisonment and trial, Marie Antoinette displayed extraordinary composure but also exhibited signs of dissociative behavior, symptoms that had been noted in other Habsburg women under extreme duress. Guards reported moments of disorientation, difficulty concentrating during questioning, and a noticeable tendency to emotionally withdraw when under intense stress. Her execution in 1793 marked not only the end of a queen's life, but the symbolic collapse of a dynastic line that had exerted immense influence on European politics for centuries. In her final hours, witnesses observed a composed dignity, Marie Antoinette's most enduring strength, but also the quiet resignation of a woman who never fully grasped why her life had been overshadowed by so much hardship. To truly comprehend the depth of the Habsburg genetic tragedy, we must go beyond individual fates and look at entire generations devastated by centuries of intermarriage. The Spanish infantas of the late 1600s and early 1700s exemplify perhaps the most concentrated case of hereditary disaster in European aristocracy. These were the daughters and granddaughters of Charles II of Spain, whose level of inbreeding was so extreme that his genetic similarity to himself surpassed that of offspring from sibling unions. Charles II was sterile, prone to seizures, and likely intellectually impaired, the inevitable culmination of 16 consecutive generations of Habsburg consanguinity. But it was his sisters and female relatives, the infantas, who endured even more suffering, as they were still expected to marry and bear children despite their evident disabilities. Their lives unfold like pages from a tragic medical anthology. Maria Margarita, born in 1651, displayed severe cognitive and motor delays. Records describe a child who could not articulate words until the age of 7, struggled with basic mobility, and likely exhibited traits associated with autism spectrum disorder. Yet her noble lineage deemed her suitable for marriage. Her sister, Maria Theresa, suffered from a different but equally dire set of ailments. She was afflicted with the falling sickness, almost certainly epilepsy, and endured debilitating respiratory issues that made even minor physical exertion dangerous. Her facial structure was so compromised that she could only consume liquids, and her spinal deformity required physical support for her to remain upright. These young women were raised within the walls of the Alcazar of Madrid, which resembled a convalescent ward more than a royal palace. A rotating staff of doctors, surgeons, and clergymen cared for numerous children, each exhibiting a unique symptom of the same shared genetic decline. Documents from the era read less like royal correspondence and more like clinical diagnoses: epileptic fits, congenital deformities, delayed development, immune disorders, and psychological afflictions. Yet, despite their conditions, these women were still expected to fulfill the dynastic imperative of childbirth. Negotiations for their marriages persisted, not because of hope for their well-being, but because of their lineage value. Medical reports were circulated among European courts, not for empathy, but to evaluate their reproductive potential. Maria Margarita was ultimately wed to her cousin, Leopold I, who had earlier married her cousin, Margaret Theresa. The genetic loop tightened once more. The marriage quickly proved to be a failure. Maria Margarita's cognitive delays left her unable to comprehend the expectations of her role as a wife, while her physical ailments made consummation nearly impossible. The psychological toll of such unions is hard to exaggerate. These women were raised to believe that their sole purpose in life was reproduction, yet their inherited conditions made successful motherhood a near impossibility. They lived in perpetual dread of becoming pregnant, fully aware that every conception posed serious risks to their own health and was likely to result in children afflicted with even more severe deformities. Archival records from this era lay bare the human suffering in gut-wrenching detail. Letters exchanged between royal women recount stories of stillbirths, infant deaths, and the haunting dread that accompanied every pregnancy. They speak of newborns so severely malformed they couldn't survive outside the womb, of babies who lived mere hours or days before succumbing to inherited defects. The psychological consequences were catastrophic. Many of these women developed what modern medicine would classify as severe anxiety, major depression, and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They withdrew from society, shunning public appearances, gripped by shame over their appearance and their perceived failings as mothers and wives. Perhaps most heartbreaking is that many internalized the blame. Without the benefit of modern genetics, they had no way of understanding their suffering. Instead, they believed their struggles were the result of personal inadequacy or divine punishment. This misplaced guilt added yet another layer of anguish to lives already overwhelmed by pain and despair. To truly grasp the extent of their plight, we must explore the genetic mechanisms behind their suffering. When individuals closely related by blood reproduce, their offspring are significantly more likely to inherit two identical copies of detrimental recessive genes. In populations with broader genetic diversity, One healthy gene from an unrelated parent often counteracts such mutations, but repeated cousin marriages, practiced by the Habsburgs for generations, cause these harmful genes to stack up and express themselves more forcefully with each successive birth. This phenomenon, known as inbreeding depression, impacts not only physical attributes but also mental stability, immune resilience, and reproductive health. One of the most recognizable manifestations of this genetic legacy was the Habsburg formerly termed mandibular prognathisma condition that became increasingly exaggerated with each generation, to the point where some descendants could neither fully close their mouths nor eat normally. Yet the visible signs were only a surface-level indicator. Contemporary genetic research suggests Habsburg offspring also exhibited higher rates of epilepsy, cognitive impairments, emotional disorders such as chronic anxiety and depression, and weakened immune systems. Many mysterious health crises that befell royal women were likely autoimmune conditions triggered by this genetic deterioration. Their widespread fertility struggles can also be traced back to these hereditary issues. Inbreeding heightens the risk of reproductive incompatibility, making it more difficult to conceive and far more hazardous to carry a pregnancy to term. The staggering rates of miscarriage and early infant death within Habsburg bloodlines weren't solely due to outdated medical practices. They were the tragic but predictable result of generations of genetic decay. Tragically, the psychological afflictions experienced by women such as Joanna of Castile and Marie Antoinette were likely the result of genetic predispositions to mental illness that were set off by extreme emotional stress. These women were not born insane, though. They were biologically vulnerable to disorders like anxiety and depression, which were then intensified by the crushing demands placed upon them by their royal roles. What deepens the tragedy is how these issues were allowed, indeed encouraged, to continue, even in the face of glaring evidence of their consequences. Royal archives were full of reports detailing the physical and mental ailments plaguing royal children born from closely related parents. Still, cousin marriages were arranged time and again for diplomatic gain. Physicians recorded their observations in exhaustive detail, yet their findings were often viewed as medical curiosities, not as urgent warnings about the dangers of hereditary degeneration. The correlation between incestuous unions and serious health issues was there for all to see, but time and again, the needs of state and wealth preservation outweighed human compassion. The Catholic Church, which could have halted the practice by withholding approval for such marriages, instead issued religious dispensations. Even when marriages were between dangerously close relatives, they were officially sanctioned under the belief that royal bloodlines carried divine approval and needed protection at all costs, even if it led to human suffering. In some cases, the very women affected by these destructive traditions became participants in their own undoing. Raised with the belief that their lineage was superior to that of the common people, some sought out unions with relatives, thinking they were preserving their noble essence. They had no way of understanding that they were instead reinforcing a cycle of genetic damage that would haunt their descendants. What's most heartbreaking is how, with every generation, women continued to hope that the next child might be spared, hope that their family's curse might finally be broken. They endured pregnancy after pregnancy, one more dangerous than the last, enduring repeated miscarriages and the deaths of infants in the desperate belief that the next baby might be whole and healthy. The end of this tragic genetic saga came with the death of Charles II of Spain in 1700. Childless and ravaged by inbreeding to the point of impotence and cognitive impairment, Charles marked the final, devastating result of over a dozen generations of tightly knit marriages. His death not only triggered the War of Spanish Succession, but also slowly shifted European thinking. The genetic cost of royal inbreeding could no longer be ignored. While cousin marriages didn't vanish entirely, they became less frequent and more distant in bloodline, as European courts began to recognize the hereditary risks involved. The women whose lives we've examined were casualties of a system that prioritized political convenience and bloodline obsession over individual well-being. Their suffering was not divine punishment or personal failure, was the outcome of choices made by ancestors obsessed with lineage and control, blind to the long-term costs. And yet, these stories serve a greater purpose. Beyond being cautionary tales, they offer us valuable scientific insights. Much of what we know today about genetics, about recessive traits, hereditary illness, and the importance of genetic diversity comes from studying the consequences of royal inbreeding. In a way, the suffering of these women advanced human understanding, even as it marked some of history's darkest familial tragedies. Their suffering has played a pivotal role in advancing our understanding of genetics and why maintaining genetic variety is vital to overall health. While royal inbreeding of this magnitude has largely faded into history, its underlying causes persist in different guises. In some remote parts of the world, cousin marriage continues and, often with similar inherited health issues. The ongoing conflict between upholding cultural traditions and safeguarding biological integrity remains relevant today. On a broader scale, these accounts serve as stark reminders of what happens when individuals are treated as tools rather than as human beings worthy of autonomy and compassion. The Habsburg women were valued not for who they were, but for what they could produce, male heirs to sustain a dynasty. Their personal aspirations and well-being were consistently overshadowed by political strategy. This reduction of women to reproductive vessels isn't confined to bygone royal courts. Across history and even in many places, today women have been judged primarily by their ability to bear children, their identities shaped by the needs of others. The Habsburg case is a particularly harrowing illustration of a problem that continues in various cultural and societal settings worldwide. Now, as we close the book on these harrowing biographies, we're left with a sobering truth. The agony endured by these women was not without consequence, though it brought them no justice. The meticulous documentation of their conditions found in royal archives and early medical records laid the groundwork for the science of genetics. The Habsburg lineage, as horrifying as its legacy was for those born into it, inadvertently advanced scientific understanding of heredity and genetic disorders. What we now know about recessive alleles, inherited diseases, and the benefits of genetic diversity comes partly from the painful lessons of their intermarried bloodlines. This fact does not lessen the horror they experienced, but it does mean that their legacy includes an important contribution to science. The hard-won knowledge drawn from their afflictions has helped humanity avoid repeating such genetic calamities. The women at the heart of this story, Maria Anna of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Teresa, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the many forgotten infantas of Spain were not merely names in textbooks. They were human souls who experienced deep sorrow and immense pain, and whose lives were dictated by choices made long before their births. They were daughters, sisters, queens, and mothers who deserved far more than what fate, politics, and family ambition allowed. Their lives remind us why human dignity must never be sacrificed for political ambition, and why we must always question systems that prioritize legacy over life. Even the grandest institutions can inflict profound suffering when they abandon the principles of compassion and empathy. Let us return, one final time, to that haunting moment of realization we imagined at the outset, waking to the knowledge that your very existence was shaped by the reckless choices of those obsessed with bloodline over well-being. For the women whose stories we have unearthed, this was not some distant thought experiment, it was the daily truth of their lives. They lived knowing that every ache in their bodies, every shadow on their minds, every failed pregnancy and moment of social alienation stemmed from a singular, haunting source, a genetic legacy corrupted by centuries of intermarriage. Their burden was not only their own, it was the accumulated consequence of countless misguided choices made by those in power who should have acted differently. Yet within that immense suffering lies a striking truth about the endurance of the human soul. Despite the chains of their lineage, many of these women found ways to reclaim fragments of their identity. Maria Anna immersed herself in scholarship, seeking mental liberty where her physical body betrayed her. Joanna clung to her deep emotional intensity, even as the world labeled her insane. Margaret Theresa endured her fate with quiet strength. Anna turned to faith for refuge. Marie Antoinette faced her execution with unflinching poise. Their lives prove that, even in bleakest times, the human spirit persists in asserting its dignity, and their experiences call upon us to reflect, to recognize the cost of allowing political, social, or ideological ambitions to override human compassion. The era of obsessive bloodline preservation may have ended in its most visible form, but the memory of these women lingers as a solemn warning, a reminder of what is lost when tradition outweighs empathy, and power is prized over kindness. Their legacy is dual in nature, heartbreaking because their agony could have been avoided, yet redemptive, because through their tragedies, humanity learned an invaluable lesson. Thanks to their lived stories, the world began to see the catastrophic consequences of unchecked genetic manipulation. They paid with their lives so that future generations might grasp a truth their ancestors ignored, that the value of a person lies not in pedigree, but in the courage to embrace our shared humanity. Though their voices were silenced by time and death, they still whisper to us, through the centuries, bearing one resonant plea: do not remember us merely for our crowns or the political roles we played. Remember us as individuals who were denied the lives we should have had. Carry our memory and use it to spare others from the price we paid for the illusion of genetic purity.